the girl, tied to the tree, and the German shepherd who heard her cry. In a quiet Vermont village, where doors are left unlocked and children chase fireflies until dusk, no one imagined danger could hide so close. 6-year-old Clara Mayfield was the heart of Maple Hollow, always laughing, always carrying her ragged teddy bear, Mr. Buttons. But one grey afternoon, innocence turned to nightmare. 2 boys, restless and careless, led Clara into the woods under the promise of a secret game. What happened beneath the towering pine left scars that no rope could match. The silence of abandonment, the terror of believing no one was coming. Yet the forest had its watchers. A retired German shepherd named Valor lifted his head that night, ears pricked at the faintest cry carried by the wind. What followed would not only save Clara's life, but change an entire village forever. The village of Maple Hollow, tucked between the rolling hills of Vermont, had always been a place where time seemed to move more gently. Morning light spilled through lace curtains. Evenings carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and children's laughter often echoed across the meadows. Among them, one little girl stood out like a spark of sunlight in human form. Clara Mayfield, 6 years old, with a tumble of chestnut curls, a smile that arrived as easily as breath, and a teddy bear so worn it was nearly more thread than stuffing. The villagers called the bear Mr. Buttons, though most of his buttons were long gone. To Clara, he wasn't just a toy. He was her confidant, her fellow adventurer, the one who knew all her secrets whispered under blankets at night. Each morning, Clara tucked Mr. Buttons under her arm before running out to greet the world. She would leap over the low stone wall by her grandmother's garden, chase butterflies until she tripped into the grass, and wave to passing neighbors as if she were greeting royalty. Children in small towns often carry the weight of many eyes, and Clara bore it gladly. Shopkeepers slipped her peppermint sticks when she visited with her grandmother. Old Mrs. Dunbar, who lived near the church, claimed Clara's laughter, reminded her of her own daughter, who'd been gone for decades. Clara, in turn, seemed to belong to everyone, a child of the village, her joy a gift freely given. Among her companions were 2 neighborhood boys, Eli and Mason, 13 years old and restless with the kind of energy that brewed in boys too old for childish games, but too young to be men. They lived next door to each other, spent summers climbing trees and winters building forts, and had taken to teasing Clara whenever she crossed their path. They tugged her curls, stole Mr. Buttons and tossed him between them, or dared her to jump from low fences. Yet Clara never cried. She would giggle breathlessly, chase after them, and beam as though even their mischief was proof of friendship. It was innocence in its purest form, the kind of blind trust children give without question. Clara saw in the boys not cruelty, but older brothers to impress, protectors who laughed loudly and walked boldly into places she was too small to reach. She adored them for their confidence, not noticing the edges of recklessness in their games. On warm afternoons, she often found them loitering near the Mayfield fence. She'd run out, clutching Mr. Buttons, her shoes untied, cheeks flushed with the thrill of seeing them. They would roll their eyes, act annoyed. But when Clara insisted on tagging along, neither ever told her to go away. Perhaps, deep down, they liked the way she looked at them, as though they were larger than life, heroes in her small story. That spring, the village brimmed with the ordinary joys of rural life. Church bells, the creak of wagons at the market, the smell of fresh bread from Mrs. Doyle's bakery. For Clara, every day was a new adventure. She would balance along the wooden fence, arms stretched wide like a tightrope walker, until she lost her balance and tumbled into laughter. She gathered wildflowers, braiding them into clumsy crowns, and delivered them proudly to her grandmother. She hummed nonsense tunes as she skipped down the lane, her voice carrying across the fields. To the villagers, it was a season like any other. To Clara, it was a childhood she believed would last forever. But childhood, like springtime in Vermont, is fragile. The same breeze that carries laughter also carries shadows. Even as Clara laughed, the boys began to change. They had grown taller over the winter, their voices rougher, their curiosity darker. They were no longer content with games of tag or dares to climb rooftops. Their conversations began to twist toward secrecy, toward proving themselves not just to Clara, but to each other. They wanted to feel older, braver, to test boundaries unseen. And Clara, with her unwavering trust and wide-eyed loyalty, never sensed the shift. She continued to follow them with her whole heart, never once imagining that her trust could be broken. Her days still glowed with innocence, running barefoot in grass, damp with dew, kneeling to watch ants carry crumbs, inventing fairy tales where Mr. Buttons was a knight in shining armor. Each of these moments was a thread in a tapestry of childhood, too delicate for the rough hands of adolescence. But beneath the sunlight and laughter, in the quiet edges of Maple Hollow, a darker promise stirred. One that would soon test not just Clara's innocence, but the very soul of the village. And the first whisper of that promise came not with thunder or warning, but in the careless laughter of two boys who thought cruelty could be disguised as play. In the restless hush that often drapes a small town like Maple Hollow, boys on the cusp of adolescence carry an energy that cannot be contained by fences or chores. Eli Harper and Mason Reed were no exception. 13 years old, with limbs too long for their bodies, and voices caught between childhood squeaks and something deeper. They prowled the edges of their world in search of anything that could make them feel older than they were. Restlessness had become their companion. Days that once brimmed with innocent races across fields or games of hide-and-seek now stretched long and dull. Their parents still spoke of responsibility, of homework and woodcutting. But inside the boys' chests burned a different fire, a hunger to push boundaries, to prove they were no longer children. That hunger often found its outlet in the smallest of cruelties. And Clara Mayfield, with her boundless trust and wide-eyed admiration, became the easiest target. The boys did not hate Clara. In their own way, they even liked her. But liking, in the clumsy world of early adolescence, twisted into something careless. They enjoyed how easily she believed their every word, how she laughed even when they meant to frighten her, how her loyalty made her follow them without hesitation. To them, she was a willing audience, a canvas for their experiments in daring. One afternoon, the three of them lingered near the Mayfield fence. Clara, barefoot and clutching Mr. Buttons, pressed her face through the slats, beaming. "Play with me," she called, her voice ringing like a bell. Eli rolled his eyes, though a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Don't you ever get tired of that ratty old bear?" Clara hugged Mr. Buttons tighter, unbothered. "He's not ratty. He's brave." "Braver than you?" Mason snorted. "Braver than me? That thing couldn't scare a squirrel." He lunged forward, snatching Mr. Buttons from Clara's arms in one swift motion. Clara gasped, her small hands reaching for the bear, but Mason tossed it high into the air, grinning as Eli caught it. "Careful, he might fly away," Eli taunted, waving the limp bear by one frayed arm. Clara laughed breathlessly, hopping in circles beneath them. "Give him back. He doesn't like heights." The boys exchanged a glance, the shared delight of holding something fragile in their hands, and knowing they could break it, but choosing not to. They tossed Mr. Buttons back and forth, Clara darting between them like a sparrow. Each time she giggled, believing the game was harmless, believing they would never let real harm come to what she loved. Finally, Eli dropped the bear into Clara's arms. She hugged it fiercely, her smile wide, unshaken. "See? He's fine. He always is." To the boys, her laughter was both satisfying and frustrating. They wanted her to cry, to gasp, to finally realize she was too small for their games. Instead, she always responded with joy, as though her innocence was a shield they could not pierce. But beneath their laughter, a shadow began to grow. The boys had started whispering to each other in recent weeks, low, secretive murmurs, when Clara wasn't close enough to hear. They spoke of dares that stretched beyond stone fences and haylofts, of legends about the forest at the edge of town, old stories told by hunters about spirits that wandered beneath the pines, about a tree older than the village itself. "Let's show her the place," Mason muttered one evening as they leaned against the old barn wall, their faces lit by the fading glow of dusk. Eli hesitated. "What place?" "The tree. You know, the one my brother told me about. They say if you stand there after dark, you hear whispers. Like voices of the dead." His grin widened. Bet she wouldn't laugh then. Eli's eyes flickered. He wasn't immune to the thrill of fear, nor to the temptation of proving himself braver. And Clara, innocent, trusting Clara, would follow them anywhere. They began to weave the idea between themselves like a secret pact. Not yet, not tonight, but soon. They would show her. They would tie her to the tree, just long enough to scare her, to hear her beg. It would be harmless, they told themselves. Just a game. She'd laugh afterward, like she always did. But a different satisfaction simmered beneath their excuses. The satisfaction of power. For now, their mischief remained on safer ground. They dared Clara to climb higher in the apple tree than her grandmother would ever allow. They told her there were fairies hiding under the old stone bridge, then laughed when she crawled through mud trying to find them. They whispered of monsters in the barn loft, only to jump out from behind hay bales and watch her squeal. And always, Clara laughed. Breathless, cheeks flushed, curls tangled. She never once accused them of cruelty. To her, their tricks were proof that they wanted her around, that she belonged in their world. That trust was a fragile gift, one the boys did not understand, one they did not value. On one particularly grey afternoon, Clara sat cross-legged in the grass, twirling a daisy between her fingers, humming to herself. Eli nudged Mason with his elbow. "Let's tell her," he whispered. Mason grinned. "Yeah, let's make it a secret. Our secret." They approached Clara, crouching low, voices dipped in conspiracy. "Clara," Eli said, his tone coaxing. "Do you want to see something no one else has seen?" Her eyes widened. "Something secret?" Mason nodded, his voice hushed. "In the forest, past the creek, there's a place. Special. But only the bravest can go there." Clara clutched Mr. Buttons tightly, her face brightening with delight rather than fear. "I can be brave," she declared. "Me and Mr. Buttons, show me." The boys exchanged a look, their smiles sharp and satisfied. Behind Clara, the forest loomed, its pines swaying in the wind, their shadows stretching long across the meadow. The woods seemed to listen, to wait. And though Clara laughed, the game they imagined no longer belonged to the safe world of childhood. It was the beginning of something darker, born not from malice alone, but from the careless hunger of children, desperate to feel powerful. Clara believed she had been invited into a secret adventure. The boys believed they had found a way to prove their courage. The forest, silent and watching, knew better. The afternoon sky hung low, a quilt of grey clouds stitched tightly over Maple Hollow. The air smelled faintly of rain, though no drops had yet fallen. In the distance, the forest stood like a wall of shadows at the edge of the fields, pines rising so tall they seemed to scrape the underbelly of the sky. The villagers often said that when the light dimmed, the forest seemed to breathe. And on this day, it did. Clara Mayfield sat cross-legged in the grass outside her grandmother's house, humming softly to Mr. Buttons. She pressed the ragged bear's snout to her ear as if listening for his reply, then giggled and whispered back. Her curls spilled forward, hiding her face, but the sound of her laughter carried. From the road, Eli and Mason appeared, their heads bent close in conversation. Their words were hushed, conspiratorial, carried more on breath than sound. "Today," Mason muttered. Eli hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yeah. Let's see if she'll come. She always does." They walked toward Clara, their boots scuffing the dirt. When she noticed them, her face lit up like dawn breaking through clouds. She leapt to her feet, hugging Mr. Buttons tight against her chest. "You came," she chirped, bouncing in place. The boys exchanged a glance, not with the easy playfulness of before, but with the seriousness of a plan finally taking shape. "Clara," Eli said, lowering his voice, "we want to show you something." Her eyes widened, round as marbles. "Something special?" Mason crouched until his face was level with hers. "Something secret," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "It's in the forest, past the creek. Only the bravest can go there." Clara's grip on Mr. Buttons tightened, but her smile only grew. "I can be brave. Mr. Buttons, too. He's not scared of anything." She lifted the bear proudly, as if to prove her point. The boys smirked. They knew she would agree. She always did. And in her eager face, they saw not innocence, but opportunity. Behind her, the forest loomed larger, dark branches swaying though the air was still. The first whispers of wind curled through the pines, carrying with it a sense that something, or someone, was listening. "Meet us by the stone bridge after dinner," Eli said, his voice hushed like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. "Don't tell anyone. Not your grandmother. Not anybody." Clara nodded vigorously, curls bouncing. "I won't. I promise." She pressed her lips to Mr. Button's forehead, as though sealing the vow with a kiss. Mason leaned back, his eyes narrowing with satisfaction. "Good. Then tomorrow, you'll know what real bravery feels like." The boys walked away, shoulders squared, speaking in low tones again. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her heart racing with excitement. To her, this wasn't mischief or danger. It belonged. The boys had chosen her to share in a secret, a hidden adventure that only the brave could see. She hugged Mr. Buttons tightly, whispering, "We're going on an adventure, you and me." "Just don't tell Grandma." Her grandmother's voice called faintly from the house, urging her inside before the rain came. Clara skipped back to the porch, her feet light, her spirit lifted by the promise of tomorrow. She never once looked at the forest as the boys had. She saw it as a stage for her imagination, not a mouth waiting to swallow her laughter. But the forest did not see her the same way. Its silence pressed heavy, the pines swaying like watchers. The path beneath the trees lay hidden in shadow, damp and unyielding. If anyone had been standing at the edge just then, they might have heard it. A low groan of branches, a whisper of leaves, like a warning spoken too softly to be understood. Clara heard nothing. She only knew that she had been invited into a secret, and to a child's heart there is no greater honor. As twilight crept across Maple Hollow, the boys sat in Mason's barn loft, whispering with excitement. Their plan was simple. Lead Clara to the great pine in the forest, tie her there just long enough to scare her, then laugh as she begged to be let go. It was harmless, they told themselves. Just a test of courage, a story to tell later. But beneath the bravado, both boys felt the thrill of something sharper, the weight of control. They were no longer just teasing her in the safety of the yard. This was different. This was the forest, and the forest had a way of making everything darker. "Do you think she'll cry?" Eli asked. Mason grinned. "Of course. That's the point." They laughed, but the sound faltered, swallowed by the shadows gathering outside the barn window. That night, Clara placed Mr. Buttons on the windowsill beside her bed. The bear's stitched smile faced the darkness, where the forest line met the horizon. She whispered to him about bravery, about secrets, about the adventure waiting just beyond tomorrow. Then she curled beneath the quilt her grandmother had sewn, the excitement fluttering in her chest like a caged bird. She did not know that her promise, so small, so innocent, had already shifted the air around her. The forest was waiting, and soon it would answer. The forest had always been there, a dark, breathing boundary at the edge of Maple Hollow. In summer daylight, it looked almost inviting, its green canopy fluttering in the wind. But once evening crept near, the pines grew taller, their shadows heavier, and the air colder, as though sunlight had never truly belonged inside. That afternoon, with the sky already bruised by grey clouds, the forest seemed less like a backdrop and more like a gate into something unknown. Clara Mayfield didn't notice. To her, the pines were simply bigger trees, the path a new game. She skipped along the dirt track, her shoes smudged with mud, her voice rising in a sing-song hum. Every so often, she lifted Mr. Buttons high into the air, spinning in circles before pressing the bear close to her chest again. Her laughter scattered the silence, bright as the call of a bird, fluttering into places where sound usually dared not go. Behind her, Eli Harper and Mason Reed exchanged looks, their strides slower, heavier. They had entered these woods before, of course, to fish at the creek, to carve initials into trunks, to play at being hunters. But never like this. The deeper they walked, the more they felt the weight of their own plan pressing down on them. Their excitement carried an edge, a thrill, tinged with unease. "Does she even know where we're going?" Eli whispered, his voice cracking slightly, as if the trees themselves might overhear. Mason shrugged, smirking to mask his own nerves. "She doesn't need to know. She'll find out soon enough." Clara twirled ahead of them, her curls bouncing. "The air smells funny here," she said cheerfully, wrinkling her nose. "Like wet dirt and pine needles." Neither boy answered. The smell she described was the forest's truth. Damp earth, rich with decay, roots tangled in silence, and the faint tang of moss clinging to bark. Above them, the pines formed a ceiling that swallowed the last of the daylight. Only thin shards of grey managed to slip through, striping the ground with faint light that looked more like scars than sunshine. Clara didn't mind. Her world was still safe, still filled with wonder. She crouched to study a line of ants carrying crumbs across the path. clapped her hands when a squirrel darted up a tree, and leaned down to sniff a cluster of mushrooms with curiosity. Every discovery was a treasure. The boys trailed her, their laughter now quieter, their bravado forced. They had promised each other this was a game, just a game. But the deeper they went, the harder it was to ignore how the forest pressed in on all sides, listening. "Are you scared?" Eli muttered, half to himself. Mason shot him a glance, bristling. "Of course not. Don't be stupid." Yet when a crow broke suddenly from the branches above, both boys flinched, their hearts leaping into their throats. Clara, however, clapped her hands in delight. "Did you see that? He was so big." She turned to them, her eyes wide with innocence. "Do you think he lives here all by himself?" Neither answered. The silence that followed stretched too long, broken only by the crunch of their shoes on the damp path. Clara slowed, tilting her head. "Why are you so quiet? Don't you like the forest?" "We like it fine," Mason muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "We just don't talk as much here. You'll see why." Clara blinked, but then smiled, content with his half-answer. She skipped ahead again, humming louder this time, as if to fill the silence the boys seemed unwilling to break. The forest grew darker still. Branches reached overhead, knotted like fingers locked in prayer. The air cooled, thick with moisture that clung to their clothes. Every step sent up the smell of crushed pine needles and earth. For Clara, the sensations were part of the adventure. For the boys, they were reminders that they were crossing into territory where laughter had no business echoing. Mason looked at Eli, his smirk faltering for the first time. "We're really doing this," he whispered. Eli swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yeah, we are." And in that quiet admission, the forest seemed to shift. A wind stirred, low and restless, carrying with it the rustle of leaves like words almost spoken. Clara didn't hear it, or if she did, she translated it into magic, into stories where the trees whispered secrets only she and Mr. Buttons could understand. She hugged the bear closer, her voice soft as she whispered, "It's okay, Buttons. They're taking us to something special." Behind her, the boys shared another glance, a flash of guilt passing briefly between them before pride forced it down. They had told themselves this would prove their courage, that scaring Clara was just a harmless prank. But standing there now, watching her small figure skip deeper into shadows, they could no longer deny the truth. The forest itself didn't think it was harmless at all. Still, Clara pressed on, fearless in her innocence. She was the light moving into darkness, humming a melody that wavered and faded as the trees closed tighter around them. And though she did not know it, every step brought her closer to a moment that would change everything. For her, for the boys, and for the village that loved her. The path beneath the pines stretched ahead, damp and endless, waiting. And the forest, quiet and watchful, seemed almost to smile. The path narrowed until it ended at a small clearing where the ground dipped low and damp. The roots of a single, towering pine clawing out of the soil like the bones of some ancient creature. Its trunk was massive, rough with age, the bark scarred by storms and seasons. The villagers called it the Old Sentinel, a tree older than the town itself. Hunters passed it in silence. Children dared each other to touch its bark, and some swore it whispered when the wind ran through its branches. To Clara Mayfield, it was simply enormous. Her eyes widened as she craned her neck to see its crown lost in the grey sky. "It's so big," she breathed, her voice hushed with awe. She hugged Mr. Buttons tightly, as though sharing the moment with him. Eli and Mason exchanged a quick glance. This was the place. Mason's hand slipped into his coat pocket and drew out a coil of rope, frayed at the edges, stolen from his father's shed. The sight of it made Eli's stomach clench, though he forced a grin. "She won't even know what's happening," Mason muttered under his breath. "Clara," Eli called, his tone falsely cheerful. "Want to play a game?" Her face lit instantly. "A game? What kind?" "A brave game," Mason said, stepping closer. His grin stretched wide, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll stand here, at the biggest tree in the forest. If you can stay still without moving, you'll prove you're the bravest of all." Clara's curls bounced as she nodded eagerly. "I can do that. Mr. Buttons will help me." She pressed the ragged bear against her cheek, her trust unshaken. Mason dropped the rope to the ground, letting it unfurl like a snake across the roots. Clara tilted her head, curious, but showed no fear. "What's that for?" she asked. "It's part of the game," Eli said quickly, his voice tightening with nerves. "You have to be tied up, like knights in a story. It makes it harder." "That's the challenge," Clara giggled, the sound ringing out bright and unguarded. "Like when the princess is locked in a tower?" "Exactly," Mason said. "Except you're braver than a princess. You'll see." She stepped willingly against the trunk of the old sentinel, her small hands resting against its bark. She didn't notice how the boy's hands shook as they looped the rope around her wrists, pulling it snug against the rough surface. She giggled again, shifting her feet as if the scratch of bark tickled her palms. "Is this tight enough?" Mason asked, glancing at Eli. Eli nodded stiffly, though he avoided Clara's eyes. "Yeah, it's fine." The rope wound around her arms and chest, the fibers rough against her skin. Clara wriggled but kept laughing, thinking it was all pretend. "Don't forget Mr. Buttons," she said, holding the bear out. Mason hesitated, then stuffed the toy into the crook of the roots at her feet. "He can watch you be brave," he muttered. "There," Eli said, stepping back. "Now you can't move. That's the point. You have to stay until we say stop." Clara smiled brightly, trusting them still. "I can do it. I'll win the game." The boys laughed. But it wasn't the easy laughter of shared fun. It was sharp, nervous, forced, echoing too loudly in the stillness of the clearing. They stepped back, their faces pale, though neither would admit to doubt, and then, in a moment Clara could never have expected, they turned away. "Wait," she said lightly, still smiling. "Where are you going?" No answer. Only Mason's muttered, "Let's see how long she lasts," as he tugged at Eli's sleeve. Her giggle faltered. "You're supposed to stay here. Aren't you playing too?" The boys didn't look back. They walked toward the path, their voices low, fading into the trees. Clara blinked, her smile slipping. The bark pressed rough against her cheek. She tugged at the rope, expecting it to loosen easily, but it held firm. "Hey," she called, her voice small. "You forgot to tell me when the game's over." The only reply was the creak of branches overhead. For a few moments she laughed nervously, as though pretending they were still nearby. "Okay, you're tricking me," she said, her tone sing-song. "I know you're hiding. Come out." Silence. The forest had grown still, as though it too were holding its breath. Clara tugged harder at the rope, her wrists already raw. Mr. Buttons lay at her feet, damp with soil, his stitched smile tilted up at her helplessly. Her giggles faded into uncertain whimpers. "Eli? Mason? This isn't funny anymore." No answer. The old sentinel loomed above her, indifferent, its bark digging deeper into her small arms. The fading light painted the clearing in bruised colors, shadows stretching long and sharp. And for the first time, Clara Mayfield felt the first edge of fear. The clearing grew heavy with silence once the boys' footsteps disappeared. For a moment, Clara stood still, her small body pressed against the rough bark of the old sentinel, a nervous smile clinging stubbornly to her lips. She listened, expecting their laughter to break out from behind the trees, for them to leap back with shouts of "Got you!" But no one came. The rope cut deeper into her wrists as she tugged experimentally. It scraped, rough and unyielding, the fibers burning her skin. "Okay," she called, her voice too bright, trembling at the edges. "You can come out now. I know you're hiding." Only the creak of branches answered. Her smile faltered. She looked down at Mr. Buttons lying at her feet, his fabric damp where the roots cradled him. His buttonless eyes stared up at her, wide and unblinking. "It's fine," she whispered to him. "They'll be back." The wind shifted. A chill slipped through the clearing, threading between the pine trunks, carrying with it the earthy scent of moss and decay. Clara shivered. Her dress, light and thin, did nothing against the growing cold. The forest began to speak in its own language, the rustle of leaves like whispers, the crack of a branch somewhere unseen, the distant call of a bird that sounded less like song and more like warning. The noises layered on top of one another, filling the silence with menace. Clara's hum, the little tune she always used to comfort herself, rose softly from her lips. But the sound was swallowed quickly by the dark, leaving her more unsettled than before. "Eli?" she tried again, her voice cracking. "Mason?" Nothing. The shadows thickened as the light drained from the sky. Day had not yet become night, but the in-between hour painted everything in shades of blue and grey. The old sentinel seemed to grow taller, its branches clawing upward, its trunk holding her tighter. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She tugged at the rope again, harder this time, the bark digging into her skin until it stung. "Stop it," she whispered fiercely to no one, as if she could scold the boys back into existence. "You're being mean. This isn't funny." Her voice broke, and the first sob slipped free. The sound startled her, echoing back from the trees as though the forest were crying too. She pressed her cheek against the bark, her breath shallow, her chest rising and falling too quickly. The air grew colder still. With each passing moment, the warmth of the afternoon drained from her body. Goosebumps prickled her arms. Her small teeth began to chatter. She closed her eyes tightly, imagining her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of bread, the warmth of the fire, the soft hum of lullabies sung under the breath. She tried to hold that image, but the forest was stronger. The noises pressed in, louder now, the scurry of something small across the underbrush, the far-off howl of wind that sounded almost like a cry. Her sobs deepened. "Grandma!" she cried out, her voice ringing through the trees. "Mama!" No one answered. The forest swallowed her pleas. She looked down again at Mr. Buttons. Her arms strained against the rope, reaching, but the bear was just out of reach. She leaned forward desperately, her fingers grazing his damp fur before slipping back. Her body jerked from the effort, and the rope dug cruelly into her wrists. "No," she whispered. "Don't leave me too." Her strength gave out, and Mr. Buttons slid deeper into the damp ground, his once white stuffing stained by mud. He lay on his side at the base of the tree, abandoned by accident, a silent witness to her fear. The loss of him, even just inches away, shattered something inside her. Clara wept openly now, her small body shaking, her cries ragged and raw. Her voice cracked again and again as she called for those she trusted most. "Grandma, Mama, please." But the night had begun to fall. The clearing, once painted in muted twilight, sank into deeper shadow. The first stars pricked faintly through the canopy, though no light reached her here. The world became narrow. The bark against her cheek, the rope burning her wrists, the cold sinking into her bones. She pressed her forehead to the tree, her tears soaking into the cracks of its bark. Her breaths came in hiccups, shallow and trembling. "Please," she whispered to the dark, "don't let them leave me here." The forest gave no mercy. Instead, the wind rose again, stronger this time, carrying the moan of branches rubbing together. To Clara's ears, it sounded like voices, low, muttering, mocking. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing tighter against the tree, as though she could hide within it. Her small heart pounded, too fast, too loud. Somewhere, an owl hooted, the sound hollow, ancient. And Clara realized, for the first time in her 6 short years, that she was truly alone. The rope held fast. The forest loomed. The shadows whispered. And a little girl's cries for her mother faded into the night. The forest had always been Daniel Harris's companion. Long before the grey crept into his beard, before the years carved lines around his eyes, it had been the pines and the maples that kept him company. Some men lived for noise, for towns filled with laughter, for the comfort of neighbors dropping by unannounced. Daniel lived for the silence. He was 51, though the forest had aged him in a way no calendar could measure. Broad-shouldered but stooped slightly at the neck, his body carried the weight of decades spent walking rough terrain, bending to mark trails, crouching to inspect tracks left by deer or bear. His skin was weathered, browned by countless summers under an unrelenting sun, and roughened by winters that bit at his cheeks like teeth. His eyes, however, were clear and steady, the pale grey of river stone, and they carried both weariness and patience. A widower for more than a decade, Daniel had learned how to fill the silence of an empty home. He had once shared his nights with a woman whose laughter was as constant as birdsong, but she was gone, claimed too early by illness, leaving only echoes in the walls of the cabin they had built together. There were no children to soften the edges of his solitude, no voices to greet him when the day's work was done. The forest became his family, and like any family, it demanded care. Daniel served as Maple Hollow's forest ranger. Not an official title backed by uniforms or bureaucracy, but a trust handed down from father to son. His father had walked these woods before him, carrying nothing more than a lantern and a hunting knife, ensuring the forest was respected, its balance maintained. Daniel carried on that tradition with the same quiet devotion. Each evening followed a ritual. He laced his boots tightly, checked the flashlight in his belt, and slung the battered field journal over his shoulder. He noted which trails had grown thick with underbrush, which streams had risen after rain, which trees showed signs of rot or disease. Every sound had meaning. The snap of a twig could speak of deer, the low groan of branches hinted at coming storms. He moved with the patience of someone who understood the forest, was not conquered, but negotiated with, step by step, night by night. The people of Maple Hollow seldom saw him. They knew him as a figure at the edge of town, the man who lived in the cabin near Briar Creek, who appeared when wildfires threatened, or when a bear strayed too close to the orchards. Children whispered stories about him, that he could walk through the forest without making a sound, that he could track a man for miles, that the owls themselves turned their heads to follow him. Daniel never corrected them. He preferred their stories to the truth. He was simply a man who had chosen duty over comfort, silence over noise. The forest rewarded his faithfulness. He could smell the coming of rain hours before the first drops fell. He could tell by the tension in the air when predators moved close. He could follow the faintest print in the mud as though the earth itself whispered to him. That evening, as the sky darkened and the first chills settled into the air, Daniel moved along the northern ridge. His boots pressed into soft earth, releasing the scent of pine needles crushed beneath him. He paused often, tilting his head, listening. The forest spoke to him in languages no one else bothered to learn. The call of a barred owl told him the mice were plentiful. The sudden hush of crickets told him something larger was passing nearby. He carried no fear. The woods had been his world too long for that. What others called eerie, he called familiar. Where others saw menace, he saw rhythm. Even the shadows, deepening now with each minute, were not his enemy, but his constant companions. Still, there was always a weight that came with his patrols. A quiet sense of responsibility settled on his shoulders like an old coat. If something was amiss, if poachers crossed the boundary, if a campfire was left untended, if a child wandered too far, it was Daniel who was expected to notice first. It was Daniel who would walk toward the danger while others pulled their curtains tighter. He never complained. Duty to him was not a burden, but a way of surviving grief. Each patrol kept him moving, kept him from collapsing into memories of a life that no longer existed. The forest filled the hollow places inside him, demanding vigilance in exchange for solitude. As he stopped at a ridge that overlooked the valley, Daniel leaned against a tree and looked out. The wind carried a faint shiver through the branches, bending the tips of the pines. He exhaled slowly, steady, the way a man does who belongs more to the woods than to people. Unbeknownst to him, not far away, a small child was tied to a tree, her cries beginning to echo into the night. He hadn't heard them yet, but soon he would. For now, the forest lay quiet in his care, and Daniel Harris, the ranger of Maple Hollow, walked on into the deepening dark, his lantern of duty burning steady against the shadows. Daniel Harris never walked the woods alone. His shadow, steady, four-legged and silent, moved beside him with every step. Valor, a German shepherd of striking black and tan coat, padded lightly over the pine needles, his paws falling so quietly they seemed to belong to the forest itself. His ears flicked at every sound, swiveling to track even the faintest crack of a twig or flutter of wings. The muscles beneath his fur rippled with controlled strength, every line of him built for action. Though the years had grayed the edges of his muzzle, there was nothing soft about him. Age had not dulled the sharpness of his gaze. Once, Valor had worn a harness stamped with the word K9, the kind of badge not of metal but of duty. He had served beside officers in a neighboring county, trained to detect danger, to pursue, to protect. He had known the roar of sirens, the sudden crack of gunfire, the chaos of streets where fear lived in every shadow. And through it all, he had been fearless, driven by instinct and by the unspoken bond with the man who held his leash. But service wears heavy on even the strongest. An injury to his hind leg, not enough to cripple but enough to slow, ended his days as an active K9. While some might have seen him as used up, Daniel Harris saw something else entirely. Daniel had been there when the county quietly sought someone to take the retired dog. He had stepped forward without hesitation. Perhaps it was pity. Perhaps it was recognition. Two creatures marked by time, by loss, no longer needed in the bustling heart of the world, yet still holding more strength than most would guess. Whatever the reason, Valor found his way to Daniel's cabin, and in the seasons since, their bond had deepened into something beyond words. On patrol, Valor walked just ahead, his nose close to the ground, pausing when he caught a scent, glancing back when the trail required Daniel's choice. Daniel rarely spoke aloud. He didn't need to. A tilt of his head, a subtle gesture of his hand, the slowing of his stride. Valor understood them all. In return, Daniel understood the flick of an ear, the tightening of muscle along the dog's shoulders, the shift of his breathing when the world changed around them. They moved like two halves of the same body, each anticipating the other, each filling the silence with presence rather than noise. Tonight, the forest was unusually restless. Valor stopped often, lifting his nose, sniffing the air. His tail, usually carried with calm confidence, lowered slightly, betraying a tension Daniel didn't yet share. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured, his voice low, steady. Valor didn't bark. He rarely did, unless danger was certain. Instead, he shifted his stance, his gaze fixed on the deeper woods. Daniel trusted that instinct. He always had. In the long hours when loneliness pressed heavy on him, it was Valor who steadied the weight. The cabin was no longer empty, not with the shepherd lying near the fire, his breathing a rhythm Daniel found as comforting as a heartbeat. On the nights when Daniel dreamed of his late wife and woke with the ache of loss hollowing his chest, Valor was there, pressing close, silent but certain, reminding him that he was not alone. In the woods, Valor's loyalty became Daniel's anchor. No human partner could have matched the dog's vigilance. Where Daniel's eyes saw only darkness, Valor's nose mapped the invisible. Where Daniel's ears caught only the sigh of wind, Valor could separate footsteps from rustle, fear from movement. The ranger and the shepherd, man and beast. Solitude shared, not endured. Daniel crouched briefly, running his hand along Valor's back. The fur beneath his palm was thick, coarse, and warm. The dog leaned into the touch just slightly, not needily, not demanding, but acknowledging. That was how they spoke. Not in words, but in small, grounding gestures. "Another mile," Daniel said quietly. "Then we'll head back." Valor lifted his head, eyes glinting amber in the dim light, and padded forward again, obedient but alert. If Daniel had looked closer, he might have noticed that the shepherd's ears remained stiff, his nose twitching constantly, his every step sharpened by a sense that something was wrong. Valor already knew what Daniel did not, that the forest was holding a secret tonight, one that would soon call them into the heart of it. For now, they walked on. Two souls bound by loyalty, moving together through the gathering dark, unaware that a little girl's cries were about to weave their lives into hers forever. And though Daniel carried no lantern, Valor's presence was its own light, steady and unyielding against the encroaching night. The woods that night felt older than usual, as though the darkness itself had roots. Daniel Harris moved with his steady rhythm, boots sinking into soft earth, flashlight beam cutting a thin path through the trees. Beside him, Valor padded silently, his presence a living shadow. It was a night like countless others, quiet but for the wind sliding between the branches and the occasional rustle of unseen wildlife. And then Valor stopped. It was abrupt. So suddenly, Daniel took 2 more steps before realizing his companion was no longer moving. The shepherd's body stiffened, tail rigid, ears pricked high. His nose twitched, drawing in something the man could not sense. A low sound rumbled from deep in his chest. Not loud, Not yet, but vibrating like distant thunder. Daniel froze, his hand tightening instinctively on the flashlight. He knew Valor well enough to trust that sound. It was not the growl of irritation, nor the bark of alert playfulness. This was something deeper, primal, a warning. "What is it, boy?" Daniel whispered. His voice seemed too loud in the hush of the forest. Valor didn't look back. His amber eyes were locked on the deeper shadows beyond the clearing. The muscles along his shoulders bunched, coiled like a spring. He tugged against the leash, sharp, insistent. Daniel's heart beat faster, though his face remained composed. Years in the woods had taught him not to panic, but even he could feel the shift in the air. It was as if the forest itself had drawn a long breath and was holding it, waiting. Another growl rolled from Valor's throat, deeper this time. He pulled harder, straining toward the dark. His body quivered with tension, every instinct in him demanding forward. Daniel swept the beam of his flashlight across the trees. Pine trunks loomed like pillars, their bark shining faintly in the pale light. The ground glistened with dampness, scattered with pine needles and roots. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, and yet he could feel it, something out there. "Easy," he murmured, crouching low to steady the shepherd with a hand on his back. The fur bristled beneath his palm, stiff as wire. Valor's breathing was fast, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. Then, carried faintly on the wind, Daniel thought he heard it, a sound too soft to name. Not an animal's cry, not the sigh of branches. It was thinner, frailer, trembling as though the forest itself was holding back tears. A child's cry. Daniel's breath caught. He tilted his head, straining to hear. The sound flickered, faint, broken, then gone again. But Valor had already heard it too. The dog lunged forward, leash snapping taut in Daniel's grip. "Hold on," Daniel hissed, rising quickly. His unease grew, but so did his certainty. There was someone out there. And if Valor was this insistent, it wasn't his imagination. The shepherd barked once, sharp and urgent, a sound that split the night. Then he turned his head, locking eyes with Daniel, as if demanding, "Now, follow me." Daniel hesitated only a second, his mind racing. Who would be in the woods at this hour? What child could possibly be wandering alone? He pictured hunters, campers, the rare hikers who underestimated the forest. But none of those explanations fit the fragile sound that still clung to the air. "All right, boy," he said, tightening his grip on the leash. "Lead the way." Valor surged forward, pulling Daniel off the familiar trail and into the deeper woods. Branches whipped against Daniel's coat, the earth uneven beneath his boots. He stumbled once, then steadied, trusting the shepherd's urgency. The forest seemed to resist them. The air thickened, the darkness heavier. Every step carried Daniel further from routine, deeper into the unknown. His chest tightened, not with fear for himself, but with a dread he hadn't felt in years. Somewhere out there, a child was alone. He knew it now. He could feel it as surely as Valor did. The cry came again, faint, cracked, like the last note of a bird falling silent. It pierced him, quick and sharp, twisting deep inside. Valor barked once more, louder this time, his body a taut line of purpose. He pulled with all the force of memory and instinct, as if he had returned to his canine days, as if the badge was still strapped to his harness. Daniel let him lead. They plunged deeper into the forest, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly across trunks and roots, never quite catching what waited ahead. But the sound was growing clearer, and with every step, Daniel Harris knew this night would not be like any other patrol. The forest had given him a duty he could not ignore. And valor, steadfast and unyielding, would drag him straight to it. The night closed around them, thick and damp, the pines whispering overhead like a chorus of uneasy sentinels. Daniel Harris tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam cutting through branches, but revealing nothing more than shifting shadows. His breath came slow and steady, though the pace of his heart betrayed him. Beside him, valor moved with sharpened urgency, every muscle strung tight as a bow. Then, suddenly, the shepherd stopped. His paws pressed into the earth, his body frozen mid-stride. His ears thrust forward, nose lifted high, nostrils flaring as though he were pulling scent directly from the wind. The ridge of fur along his back rose stiff and sharp, a bristle that made Daniel's chest tighten. The dog's entire body trembled with tension, caught between stillness and explosion. "Talk to me, boy," Daniel whispered, though he knew valor already was. The quiver of the shepherd's nose, the locked gaze into the blackness ahead, the low rumble that started deep in his chest. These were his words. Daniel tilted his head, straining to hear. At first there was nothing, only the restless shifting of trees, the creak of branches bending under the weight of the wind. Then it came, faint, fragile, carried as if on the edge of breath. A cry. Not the cry of an animal, not the sharp alarm of prey in the underbrush. This was thinner, softer. A child's voice, breaking against the cold. Daniel's throat tightened. The sound pierced him, quick as a blade. It cut past the ranger's practiced calm, past the layers of duty, striking the part of him that remembered what it was to be a father, even if only in dreams that had never come to pass. He lifted the flashlight higher, the beam jittering against trunks and roots as his hand shook despite himself. "God help us," he muttered under his breath. "There's someone out here." Valor moved first. The shepherd's body coiled, then bolted, pulling hard against the leash with sudden violence. The growl that had vibrated low in his chest turned into a sharp bark, urgent, commanding. His stride lengthened, his paws thudding against the earth with relentless force. "Hold on, Valor!" Daniel staggered at the pull, but followed, his boots slipping in damp soil. Branches snapped against his shoulders, brambles clawed at his coat, but he didn't resist. He let the dog lead, knowing that whatever lay ahead, the shepherd had already chosen the path. The cry came again, louder now but still faint, as though it were being swallowed by the forest itself. A broken plea, cracked with exhaustion. It carried on the wind, then vanished again, leaving silence that rang louder than any noise. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had heard many sounds in the woods, the scream of foxes mistaken for human voices, the eerie laughter of loons across the lake. But this was no mistake. This was a child, alone. His flashlight beam wavered, bouncing across tree trunks, catching glimpses of roots jutting like bones from the earth. The woods seemed to close tighter with every step, the air colder, the silence heavier. His pulse hammered in his ears. "Keep going, boy," he urged, his voice low, hoarse. "Find them." Valor surged forward, his nose pressed low, weaving, then snapping straight as he caught the scent. His growl deepened, not in threat, but in urgency, as if telling Daniel they were running out of time. Daniel stumbled again, catching himself on a tree trunk. The bark was slick with dampness, his palm scraping rough against it. He pushed forward, ignoring the ache in his knees, the sting in his lungs. The cry floated once more, this time sharper, closer. A single word, fractured and desperate. "Mama!" Daniel froze mid-step, his chest tightening so hard it hurt. For a split second, the world seemed to narrow to that one sound. His mind flooded with the image of a child, small, lost, terrified. And his heart wrenched with a force he hadn't felt in years. He didn't hesitate again. "Valor!" His voice cracked. "Go!" The shepherd lunged, nearly yanking the leash from Daniel's grip. Together they plunged deeper into the forest, the ground sloping downward, the shadows thickening into something almost tangible. Every noise seemed amplified now, the crack of twigs underfoot, the rasp of branches tearing at fabric, the rasp of Daniel's own breath. And beneath it all, that thin cry, broken but stubborn, clinging to the night like a candle fighting the wind. Daniel's flashlight shook in his hand, the beam jittering wildly. He steadied it with effort, forcing himself to focus. His thoughts swirled, but his body obeyed the one command pulsing in his veins. Find the child. Valor's pace quickened, his barks sharp, cutting through the darkness. Each sound echoed like a promise. And Daniel Harris, heart pounding, followed the shepherd's lead into the black unknown, knowing in his bones that someone's life depended on it. The cry fractured once more through the night, closer now, threading weakly between the trunks. Valor lunged toward it with renewed force, dragging Daniel down a slope slick with damp earth. His boots slipped, catching on roots, but the shepherd gave no pause. His body was a line of pure instinct, his muscles burning with the urgency of a creature who knew the difference between noise and need. Then Daniel's flashlight swept across the clearing. The beam snagged on the colossal trunk of a pine, its bark furrowed deep, roots curling outward like the claws of something ancient. And there, pressed against its surface, was a child. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She was small, far too small for the vastness of the tree that held her. Rope bound her wrists cruelly, digging into skin rubbed raw. Her cheeks were streaked with grime and tears, her lips trembling as she fought against sobs that had already stolen her voice. Her thin dress clung damp against her, the night air biting into her fragile frame. She shivered violently, her head lolling forward before jerking back at the sound of approaching footsteps. The beam of light caught her eyes, wide, glassy, swollen from crying. For an instant, she looked more like a ghost than a child. Daniel's heart clenched, an ache so sharp it stole his breath. He had seen accidents, found hunters injured in storms, dragged lost hikers back to safety. But nothing prepared him for this. A little girl bound to a tree, abandoned to the dark. At her feet lay a stuffed bear, its once-loved fabric sodden with dew, its seams caked with dirt. One ear sagged forward, its stitched smile smeared and crooked. Mr. Buttons. Daniel felt his throat tighten. That bear, soaked and discarded, spoke of innocence violated in a way no rope ever could. Before he could move, Valor surged forward. The shepherd bolted into the clearing, nose low, tail stiff with determination. His bark rang out, fierce and echoing. Not a sound of aggression, but of declaration. "I've found her. She's here." The child flinched at the noise, her body jerking against the ropes. But when Valor skidded to a halt in front of her, his entire posture shifted. The sharp lines of his body softened. The growl melted into a low whimper. He pressed forward, muzzle nudging her knees, then leapt up gently, licking her cheeks where tears had carved streaks through dirt. Clara gasped, a sound caught between shock and relief. For a moment she stared at the shepherd with trembling fear. Then her small hands flexed uselessly against the rope, reaching for him. Her lips parted, and a broken whisper slipped free. "You found me." Vala whined, frantic now, licking at her face with urgency, pawing lightly at the ropes as though his claws could undo them. His body curved protectively around her, his warmth pressing against her chilled skin. He barked again, shorter this time, urgent, looking back at Daniel as if to demand, "Hurry, don't stand there, help her." Daniel was already moving. His boots hit the clearing hard, his chest heaving with the force of his own heartbeat. He dropped to his knees beside her, the flashlight clattering into the grass, its beam tilting sideways to illuminate the roots where Mr. Buttons lay. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice breaking despite himself. "It's all right. You're safe now. I've got you." Her eyes darted to him, wide, wet, unbelieving. Then back to Vala, who refused to leave her side. Daniel reached for the rope. His hands, roughened by years of work, trembled as he tugged at the knots. The fibers were wet, tightened by the child's struggles. He pulled harder, cursing under his breath. "Damn it!" Vala whined again, licking Clara's cheek, pressing his body closer as if to lend her strength. Daniel forced his breathing steady, his jaw tight. He worked the knot with desperate focus, his fingers raw against the coarse rope. Finally, it loosened, slipping just enough for him to tear the rest free. The rope unraveled from around her wrists, tumbling into the mud. The moment her arms were free, Clara sagged forward, her body too weak to hold itself upright. Daniel caught her quickly, scooping her against his chest. She was light, terrifyingly light, her skin icy beneath her damp dress. Her little arms clung to him instinctively, her head dropping against his shoulder. "I thought," her voice cracked, thin and broken, "no one would come." Daniel closed his eyes, his throat burning. "I'm here," he whispered fiercely. "We're here. You're not alone anymore." Vala pressed close against Daniel's knee, whining softly, his eyes never leaving the child's face. He pawed once at Mr. Buttons on the ground, as if even the bear mattered in this rescue. Daniel leaned down, snatched the sodden toy from the roots, and tucked it against Clara's side. Her fingers clutched it weakly, as though even in near unconsciousness she knew it was hers. The forest loomed around them, shadows pressing closer, but Daniel no longer saw menace. He saw only the fragile child in his arms and the shepherd pressed against them both. He looked down at Vala, voice rough but steady. "Good boy. You found her." The shepherd's ears twitched, his eyes gleaming with a loyalty as fierce as fire. And for the first time that night, Daniel Harris believed they might just outrun the darkness. The knife trembled in Daniel Harris's hands. It wasn't a weakness. His grip was strong, steady from years of carving bark, cutting rope, handling snares. But now, as he knelt at the base of the ancient pine, his chest burned with a storm that even his practiced calm couldn't suppress. The rope that bound the little girl's wrists had already cut angry red grooves into her skin. Each knot was a brand of cruelty, each fiber a reminder of how carelessly children can wound one another. Daniel forced the blade under the rope, careful not to touch her skin. His jaw clenched as he saw her flinch at the scrape of steel. "Easy, sweetheart," he murmured. "Just a little more. You'll be free." Beside him, Vala pressed his body against the girl, his fur warm against her shivering arms. The shepherd licked her cheeks again and again, each pass of his tongue urgent, almost frantic, as if he could erase every tear she had shed in the darkness. The child's lips moved. Her voice was broken, hoarse from crying, but the words fell out like a prayer. "I thought no one would find me." Daniel's knife paused mid-slice. The world stilled for a heartbeat, her words piercing him deeper than any blade could. He looked into her eyes, wide, glassy, too old now for 6 years of life. In them he saw a fear that should never belong to a child, a fear that cut through his anger and lodged itself in his chest. He swallowed hard, blinking against the heat behind his eyes. "But we did," he whispered back. "We found you, and we're not leaving you here." With a sharp tug, the rope gave way. It snapped under the knife's edge and unraveled from her wrists, falling in a limp coil to the mud. Her arms dropped forward, stiff, trembling, too weak to lift. Daniel caught them gently, rubbing warmth back into her hands with his calloused palms. He could feel the bones beneath her skin, fragile and thin, trembling with exhaustion. The rest of the rope bound around her waist and chest came next. Daniel cut through it quickly, each slice cleaner, faster, his anger growing sharper with every knot he severed. He imagined the boys' laughter as they tied her, the thoughtless cruelty of leaving her to the cold. Rage surged through him, hot and choking, but he pushed it down. Rage could wait. Right now, the child needed gentleness. When the last length of rope fell free, Clara slumped forward, her body folding into Daniel's arms like a bird, too weary to keep its wings extended. He lifted her easily, her weight frighteningly light against his chest. "It's all right," he said, over and over, the words a mantra, more for himself than for her. "It's all right now." Valor pressed close, his head nudging against Clara's dangling hand. She stirred faintly, her fingers twitching until they found his fur. She clung to it desperately, burying her small face against the shepherd's head. Her voice came again, thinner now, fading into the night. "Don't let go." Daniel's throat burned. "We won't," he promised, his voice breaking. "Not ever." For a moment, he simply held her there against the great pine, the fury and the relief crashing together inside him until he felt unmoored. He had spent years in these woods, years of solitude where his only duty was to trees, trails, and the occasional wandering hunter. Tonight, the forest had demanded more of him, demanded he become witness, protector, savior. And though his arms were strong enough to carry her, he felt the weight of something larger settling on his shoulders, the weight of what had been done to her, and the weight of ensuring she never felt this terror again. Clara stirred once more, whispering something into Valor's ear. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the ground, a single wag, as if acknowledging her words. Daniel didn't catch them, but he didn't need to. He knew it was trust. He bent down, scooping the sodden bear from the mud with one hand, and tucked it gently between Clara's arm and chest. Her fingers closed around it weakly, as though reclaiming a piece of herself. Daniel rose, cradling her against him, Valor circling close at his heel. The shepherd's eyes never left Clara, his body taut and alert, ready to drive away any shadow that dared to approach. The forest around them was still alive with menace, but Daniel no longer felt its weight pressing on him. The fury within him was hotter, brighter, and it burned through the fear. He looked once more at the great pine, at the rope still dangling, at the marks of struggle left on the bark. And he swore silently that the boys who did this would understand the depth of what they had done. But that was for later. Now it was for survival. "Hold on, little one," he whispered, pressing Clara closer as Valor trotted beside him. "We're taking you home." Her head rested on his shoulder, her small breaths warm against his neck. She didn't answer, but her grip on Valor's fur never loosened. And as they stepped out of the clearing, the sound of her faint sobs mixed with the steady rhythm of the shepherd's paws, a fragile hymn of survival echoing into the night. The forest had grown quieter, though not in peace. It was the heavy quiet of a place that had just witnessed something it could not forgive. Daniel Harris carried Clara against his chest, her trembling body pressed into the wool of his jacket. Mr. Buttons clutched weakly between her small hands. Valor stalked close at his side, his ears swiveling, his amber eyes bright with vigilance. They had not gone far from the clearing when the sound of muffled laughter broke the silence. It wasn't carefree laughter. It was nervous, jittery. The kind of sound boys make when they know they've crossed a line but cling to noise to mask their fear. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw tightened, his hand instinctively adjusting Clara's weight against him. Valor froze too, nose quivering, body stiffening into a low, predatory stance. Through the dim light, two shapes emerged. Eli Harper and Mason Reed, 13 years old, their faces pale beneath the smudges of dirt, their eyes darting nervously between the trees. Their giggles died quickly when they saw Daniel, and when their eyes shifted lower, to the small, boundless shape of Clara nestled in his arms, her face streaked with tears, the color drained from their cheeks completely. Valor growled. It was not the playful rumble of a house dog, nor the warning bark of a watchdog at a fence. This was something deeper, primal, vibrating through the ground itself. His lips peeled back, revealing sharp teeth, his chest heaving with the sound of pure condemnation. The boys froze. Mason stumbled backward, his heel catching on a root. Eli lifted his hands instinctively, as though that might ward off the shepherd's fury. Their bravado, the reckless boldness that had driven them into cruelty, shattered in an instant. "Stay where you are," Daniel said. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of stone, steady and commanding. It was not loud, but it was final. A voice that belonged not just to a ranger, but to a man who had walked too many years with duty pressed against his spine. Eli opened his mouth first, his words tumbling out fast, clumsy. "We didn't mean—" "Silence." Daniel's tone cut him off like a blade. The boy's mouth snapped shut. Mason shifted his weight from foot to foot, his breathing ragged, his eyes flicking nervously to Valor, whose growl had not softened. The shepherd's body remained taut, his gaze fixed on them with unflinching judgment, as though he alone could measure the depth of what they had done. Daniel took a step forward. The beam of his flashlight caught both boys' faces, illuminating their fear. They looked so young in that light, children themselves, trembling under the gravity of a deed they had believed was only mischief. Yet Clara's sobs against his chest reminded Daniel that youth did not absolve cruelty. "Do you see what you've done?" Daniel's voice was iron. "Look at her! Look at her!" Neither boy could hold his gaze. Eli's eyes dropped to the ground, his shoulders collapsing inward. Mason tried to look away, but Valor's growl deepened, forcing his eyes back toward the child they had abandoned. "She could have frozen to death," Daniel continued, his words heavy with restrained fury. "She could have been lost forever. And you call it a game." Eli swallowed hard, his chin trembling. We just wanted to scare her. We didn't think—" "That's right." Daniel's eyes burned with controlled anger. You didn't think about what it means to be tied to a tree in the dark, to cry until your throat is raw, to believe no one is coming for you. You didn't think about the marks these ropes would leave on her skin, or the marks fear would leave on her heart. His words landed like blows, each syllable heavy, measured. Clara whimpered softly in his arms, stirring at the sound of his raised voice. Daniel adjusted her gently, pressing his chin against the top of her head. His anger was a storm, but he kept it contained, steadying his breath so the little girl would not feel its violence. Valor, however, remained uncontained. He stepped forward, his growl rolling louder, his teeth bared, his hackles sharp. The boys shrank back, their eyes wide. Mason raised his hands uselessly. "Call him off," he begged, his voice cracking. Daniel's gaze did not waver. "He knows what you did, and unlike you, he does not mistake cruelty for play." For a long moment, the only sound was Valor's growl and the ragged breaths of two frightened boys. Finally, Daniel exhaled slowly. "You will walk ahead of me, back to the village. Not a word unless I ask it. Do you understand?" They nodded quickly, fear shaking their heads as much as agreement. "Do you understand?" Daniel repeated, louder this time, his voice cracking like a whip. "Yes, sir," they both stammered. Valor gave one last rumble before falling silent, though his body remained taut, his eyes never leaving them. Daniel knew the shepherd's silence was no comfort to the boys. It was worse. It was the silence of judgment that had not yet been lifted. As they started walking, Clara stirred again in Daniel's arms. Her voice was small, fragile, but it carried into the night. "Why did they leave me?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly, the weight of her question striking deeper than any rope, deeper than the growl of any dog. He had no answer gentle enough to erase her pain. He only pressed her closer, whispering, "You're safe now." That's all that matters. But in his heart, Daniel swore that the boys and the village would not forget the answer to her question. They would remember it as long as they lived. The march back toward the village was slow and heavy, the night pressing close around them. Daniel Harris walked behind the two boys, Clara cradled in his arms, Valor pacing at his heel like a living shadow. The dog's gaze never left the boys, his amber eyes glinting with a quiet menace that made their shoulders curl inward with every step. Eli Harper and Mason Reed had started the evening with laughter. They had whispered about bravery and secrets, convincing themselves that cruelty was only a game. But now, in the silence carved out by Clara's faint whimpers and Valor's steady growl, their laughter was a memory that made them sick. Eli glanced over his shoulder once, just long enough to catch sight of Clara. She looked so small in Daniel's arms, her face pressed against his chest, her fists still clutching the sodden bear. Her eyes, though swollen from tears, were half closed now, heavy with exhaustion. She looked broken in a way that Eli had not expected. He thought she would have been angry, that she would have shouted or cried and then laughed later. He had not imagined her like this, trembling, silent, her voice nearly gone. His stomach twisted, his eyes blurred. I didn't mean," he started, his voice shaking. "Don't." Daniel cut him off. The single word landed like a stone, heavy and final. Eli bit his lip until it bled. Mason, usually the braver of the two, wasn't brave now. His pale face glistened with sweat despite the chill in the air. His hands trembled at his sides, and his steps faltered as though the ground itself resisted carrying him forward. He sniffed, the sound wet, broken. And then the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, but slow and relentless, carving tracks down his dirty cheeks. He tried to hide them at first, ducking his head, wiping his sleeve across his face. But Valor's low growl broke the silence again, and Mason flinched. The growl was not just sound. It was a reminder that there would be no hiding from what they had done. Eli's tears followed soon after. He tried to hold them back, tried to swallow the guilt that rose like bile. But the sight of Clara, limp, quiet, her breath ragged against Daniel's coat, was more than he could bear. His voice cracked when he tried again. "We didn't mean..." Daniel stopped walking. The sudden halt made both boys turn around, their faces streaked and wet, their shoulders hunched like they were already waiting for punishment. "You didn't mean," Daniel repeated slowly, his voice low, controlled, burning. He shifted Clara gently in his arms, making sure her head rested comfortably on his shoulder, before he fixed his gaze on them. His eyes, pale gray and unyielding, cut through them like winter frost. "You tied a child to a tree. You left her alone in the dark. You heard her cries, and you walked away." The boys looked down at their feet, their tears falling onto the mud. "You didn't mean," Daniel said again, sharper this time, his voice carrying the weight of fury he fought to keep contained. "But you did it. And if we hadn't found her—" He paused, the thought clawing at his throat. He couldn't finish. Valor whined softly, pressing his nose against Clara's arm as if sensing Daniel's storm. Daniel's voice dropped lower, colder. "Intent does not erase consequences. What you did will follow her. Every time she closes her eyes, she'll remember the dark. She'll remember believing she was alone. And that is not something you undo with 'we didn't mean.'" The boys broke then. Mason sobbed openly, his shoulders heaving, his voice muffled behind his hands. Eli's tears poured silently, his chest shuddering with each breath, his words caught in his throat. Their regret was real, but it was late. Too late. Daniel looked at them both, his face hard, but his heart a storm. He had seen guilt before. He had seen criminals break down in confession, hunters beg forgiveness after thoughtless kills. But this, two children, trembling beneath the weight of their own cruelty, struck differently. "You'll answer for this," he said at last. His voice was steady, his anger buried under control, but the promise was iron. "Not just to me, to her, to this village. You'll carry what you've done, and you'll learn what it means to protect what's fragile instead of breaking it." Eli sobbed louder, the words tumbling out between gasps. We didn't think it would be so bad." Daniel's voice cut clean through his tears. "That's because you've never been left alone in the dark. You've never known what it means to believe no one is coming. She knows now, and that is on you." For a long, heavy moment, silence pressed down again. The only sound was Clara's faint breathing, the rustle of the forest around them, and the boys' sobs echoing weakly in the night. Finally, Daniel adjusted Clara in his arms and nodded toward the path. "Walk." They obeyed, their small bodies bent under a weight no rope could tie and no knife could cut. Behind them, Valor's steady steps and Daniel's burning gaze made sure they would not forget the truth. Innocence, once broken, leaves scars that laughter cannot erase. The path out of the forest felt longer than it ever had before. Each step Daniel Harris took seemed measured not in distance, but in weight. The weight of the small body pressed against his chest. The weight of fury still simmering in his veins. The weight of responsibility he hadn't asked for, but could not ignore. Clara was light, almost frighteningly so. Her head rested against his shoulder, curls damp and tangled, her breath shallow but steady. In one hand, weak and trembling, she clutched Mr. Buttons, the sodden bear pressed tight against her chest. In the other, her fingers curled into Valor's fur, refusing to let go, even as exhaustion pulled her deeper into half-sleep. Valor moved at Daniel's side with the precision of a sentinel. His gait was purposeful, protective, his eyes sweeping the shadows with every step. He pressed close enough that Clara's small hand could remain tangled in his coat, his body a moving shield between her and the darkness. Every so often he glanced up at Daniel, as if checking that the man was holding steady under the burden he carried. Behind them, the two boys stumbled along the path, silent now except for the sound of their uneven breathing. Their tears had dried to streaks on their cheeks, but their faces were still pale, hollowed by fear and regret. Daniel did not spare them more than a glance. His anger had not lessened, but Clara's fragile weight in his arms mattered more than their shame. Their reckoning would come later. The forest remained alive with its own voice, the hiss of wind threading through pine needles, the crack of unseen branches underfoot, the distant cry of an owl. Yet for Daniel, every sound now felt different, less threatening, less suffocating. The moment he had freed Clara from the tree, the balance had shifted. He no longer felt like an intruder in the woods. He felt like a man carrying someone back where she belonged. Clara stirred faintly in his arms. Her lips parted, her voice a whisper so thin he almost missed it. "Thank you." The words were fractured, weak, but they pierced him more deeply than any cry of terror could have. He stopped walking, just for a moment, his throat tightening. He looked down at her face, pale, tear-streaked, but alive. Alive because they had found her in time. He swallowed hard, his voice low, hushed. "Don't thank me yet, sweetheart. Just hold on. We're almost there." Valor whined softly, brushing his head against Clara's arm, as though echoing the reassurance. She shifted weakly, her fingers tightening in his fur. Even as sleep tugged at her, she clung to him with the instinct of a child who knew, in her bones, who had saved her. Daniel adjusted her carefully, cradling her closer. Each step forward became a vow. The trees began to thin. The dense wall of shadow opened little by little, until through the branches ahead, a faint glow appeared. At first, it was only a suggestion, a soft, trembling light that looked almost like a star caught low on the horizon. But as they walked, it grew clearer. Lanterns, the village. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest loosening just enough to let relief seep in. The lights were still far, but their glow was steady, promising. Safety. Warmth. People who would hold Clara in their arms. People who would weep with both sorrow and gratitude when they saw her. Behind him, Eli stumbled on a root, catching himself with a gasp. Daniel didn't turn. He didn't speak. His silence was punishment enough, his steady stride carrying a message clearer than words. "You don't get to look away from what you did," Clara whispered again, her voice little more than breath. "Don't let me go." Daniel pressed his cheek against her tangled hair. "I won't," he said. His voice cracked, but the words held. "Not now. Not ever." Valor's ears flicked, catching every noise, but he never broke stride. He walked in perfect rhythm with Daniel, his body aligned to Clara's hand, as though he understood that this fragile connection was the one thing tethering her to calm. His fur was damp where her fingers had twisted into it, but he moved without complaint, steady as stone. At last, the path widened. The lantern glow spread further, painting the trunks with warm strokes of gold. The air shifted too, no longer damp and heavy with pine, but carrying the faint scent of wood smoke, of bread cooling on windowsills, of life waiting at the edge of the forest. Daniel's steps quickened. His arms ached from carrying her, but he barely noticed. Relief surged with each lantern that flickered into view, each reminder that they were almost home. As they broke free of the last line of trees, the village lay ahead, Small, quiet, its houses clustered close, windows glowing against the night. Daniel stopped briefly at the edge of the meadow, his chest rising and falling in deep, heavy breaths. He looked down at Clara, her lashes resting against her cheeks, her lips parted in exhausted sleep. "We made it," he whispered. Valor lifted his head, following his gaze toward the village. His ears twitched, and he gave a single, soft bark. Not warning, not threat, but acknowledgement. A sound of arrival. For the first time since he had heard her faint cry in the woods, Daniel allowed himself a moment of pure relief. His anger still burned, banked deep in his chest. But above it rose gratitude. That the shepherd had heard her, that they had found her in time, that the night had not swallowed her whole. The boys trailed behind, their heads bowed, their steps heavy. Daniel would deal with them soon enough. But not now. Now, it was for carrying a child home. And as he stepped forward once more, the glow of the village lanterns stretching wide to meet them, Daniel Harris tightened his arms around Clara Mayfield and whispered a vow into the night. Never again. By the time Daniel Harris reached the edge of Maple Hollow, the night was already whispering its secret. Word traveled faster than footsteps here. Lanterns lit, doors opened, neighbors called across the lanes. At first it was only a murmur. Something's happened. Then, as Daniel emerged from the dark with a child in his arms and a shepherd pressed close at his side, the murmur swelled. "It's Clara," someone whispered. "Little Clara Mayfield." Faces turned pale. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers stood rigid, jaws tight with disbelief. Maple Hollow had always been a place where doors stayed unlocked and children ran until dusk. Yet here was proof that innocence could be broken even in the quietest of towns. Daniel walked through the crowd in silence, exhaustion carved into his face. Clara stirred faintly, clutching her battered bear and Valor's fur. Gasps rose when lantern light revealed her tear-streaked cheeks and raw wrists. Some women wept, others covered their mouths. "She's just a baby," one whispered. Behind Daniel trailed two boys, Eli Harper and Mason Reed. Their heads hung low, hands dirty, faces wet with tears. The villagers' shock twisted into outrage. Not them. It can't be. Yet their guilt was plain, written in every bowed movement. Daniel stopped in the lane, his voice steady but low. "She was tied to a tree," he said. A ripple of horror moved through the crowd. Alone, in the dark, crying. If Valor hadn't heard her. He swallowed hard. "We might not have brought her back." Silence fell, jagged and heavy. Clara whimpered, burrowing against him. Valor pressed his muzzle to her arm, his whine a soft balm. Then Margaret Mayfield broke through, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her steps urgent with fear. She saw the child in Daniel's arms and collapsed into sobs. "Clara." Daniel knelt so she could gather the girl. "She's alive," he whispered. "She needs warmth. She needs you." Margaret clutched Clara fiercely, rocking her, tears soaking the child's tangled curls. "I thought I lost you. Lord, I thought I'd never see you again." The villagers looked on in reverent silence, some weeping openly. It was a reunion too sacred to interrupt. Clara stirred, her small hand reaching for Valor. The shepherd hadn't moved, his amber eyes locked on her. When her fingers touched him, she buried her face in his chest. "Valor saved me," she whispered. The words struck like thunder. Gasps rippled. Margaret sobbed anew. The villagers bowed their heads, reverent now not only toward the child, but toward the dog who had not left her side. "Valor saved me," Clara said again, stronger this time. Her voice carried into the night, a truth none would forget. The Mayfield cottage glowed softly against the cold dark. Inside, firelight flickered over worn rugs and shelves of preserves, making the small space feel like a sanctuary. Clara lay curled on the settee near the hearth, clutching her bear. At her feet, Valor stretched across the rug, his body curved protectively around her, eyes open, ears twitching at every sound. He had not left her since the woods, and he would not leave now. Daniel sat in a chair by the fire, boots still damp with forest mud. For once, duty did not drive him forward. For once, he allowed himself to sit. Margaret moved quietly about the cottage, then stopped near him, wringing her apron. "I don't have words," she said, her voice trembling. "If you hadn't been out there, I'd be burying my granddaughter instead of holding her." Daniel shook his head. His gaze moved to the dog. "Thank him." I only followed his lead. Margaret crouched beside Valor, laying a trembling hand on his fur. "Then thank you," she whispered. His tail thumped once against the rug, but his eyes never left Clara. Sitting opposite Daniel, Margaret's voice grew heavy. "I thought Maple Hollow would always be safe. Tonight proved me wrong." Daniel's eyes stayed on the flames. "Innocence is always fragile," he said quietly. "Doesn't matter if it's a city or a village. All it takes is one cruel moment, and the world changes. That's why someone has to be watching. Always." Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks. Clara stirred, her voice thin. "Grandma?" Margaret hurried to her side, smoothing her hair. "Yes, darling." The little girl reached for Valor's fur. "He's staying, isn't he?" "If he wants to," Margaret whispered. Valor lifted his head, pressing his muzzle to Clara's hand. She smiled faintly before drifting back into sleep. Daniel leaned back, thinking of the boys' pale faces, the rope against the bark. Clara's broken whisper, "I thought no one would find me." His chest ached with fury, but beneath it, a stronger resolve began to grow. "Children should never know fear like that," he murmured. "And if they do, it should never be because of other children." Margaret covered her mouth, unable to speak. Valor sighed, laying his head back on the rug. The room cradled them all, the fire's glow, the steady breath of the sleeping child, the silent watch of the shepherd, and the weight of a man who carried both anger and duty. That night, as the flames burned low, a truth settled heavy in the cottage. Innocence, once broken, could never be mended fully, but it could be guarded fiercely by those willing to bear the watch. And Daniel Harris, with Valor at his side, vowed he would never let such innocence slip unguarded again. By the time Daniel Harris reached the edge of Maple Hollow, the night was already whispering its secret. Lanterns lit, doors opened, neighbors called across the lanes. At first it was only a murmur. Something's happened. Then, as Daniel emerged with a child in his arms and a shepherd pressed close at his side, the murmur swelled. "It's Clara," someone gasped. "Little Clara Mayfield." Faces turned pale. Mothers clutched children. Fathers stood rigid, jaws tight. Maple Hollow had always been a place where doors stayed unlocked and safety was assumed. Yet here was proof that innocence could be broken, even in the quietest of towns. Daniel walked through the crowd in silence, exhaustion carved into his face. Clara stirred faintly, clutching her battered bear and Valor's fur. Gasps rose when lantern light revealed her tear-streaked cheeks and raw wrists. Some women wept, others covered their mouths. Behind Daniel trailed two boys, Eli Harper and Mason Reed. Their heads hung low, faces wet with tears. The villagers' shock twisted into outrage. Not them, it can't be. Yet their guilt was plain. Daniel stopped in the lane, his voice steady but low. "She was tied to a tree," he said. A ripple of horror moved through the crowd. Alone, crying. If Valor hadn't heard her, we might not have brought her back. The silence was jagged, broken only by Clara's whimper. Valor pressed his muzzle to her arm, his whine a soft balm. Then Margaret Mayfield broke through, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her steps urgent with fear. She saw the child in Daniel's arms and collapsed into sobs. "Clara!" Daniel knelt so she could gather the girl. "She's alive. She needs warmth. She needs you." Margaret clutched Clara fiercely, rocking her as though her grip alone could shield her from every shadow. "I thought I lost you. Lord, I thought I'd never see you again." Clara stirred, reaching for Valor. The shepherd had not moved, his amber eyes locked on her. She buried her face in his chest. "Valor saved me," she whispered. The words struck like thunder. The villagers bowed their heads, reverent now not only toward the child, but toward the dog who had not left her side. The Mayfield cottage glowed softly against the cold. Inside, firelight flickered over worn rugs and shelves of preserves, making the small space feel like a sanctuary. Clara lay curled on the settee, clutching her bear. At her feet, Valor stretched protectively, eyes unblinking, ears alert. Daniel sat in a chair by the hearth, boots still damp with forest mud. Margaret moved quietly, then stopped near him, her voice trembling. "If you hadn't been out there, I'd be burying my granddaughter instead of holding her." Daniel shook his head. "Thank him. I only followed his lead." Margaret crouched beside Valor, laying a trembling hand on his fur. "Then thank you," she whispered. His tail thumped once, but his eyes never left Clara. Daniel's gaze returned to the flames. "Innocence is always fragile," he said quietly. "All it takes is one cruel moment, and the world changes. That's why someone has to be watching, always." Margaret wept silently. Clara stirred, whispering, "He's staying, isn't he?" Valor pressed his muzzle to her hand, and she smiled faintly before sleep claimed her. Daniel leaned back, fury and resolve warring in his chest. Children should never know fear like that, he thought. And if they did, it should never be because of other children. Morning broke grey over Maple Hollow. Few had slept. By dawn, everyone knew what had happened in the forest, and who was responsible. The Harper and Reed families arrived with heavy steps. Eli and Mason trailed behind, eyes rimmed red, shoulders hunched. The villagers gathered in the square, mothers clutching children, fathers grim with betrayal. Valor sat at Daniel's heel, amber eyes fixed on the boys, a silent judge. Daniel's voice cut through the murmurs. "Do you know where I found your sons?" Silence. "Not helping Clara, not running for help." They were laughing while she cried herself hoarse. Mrs. Reed faltered. "They're just children. They didn't understand." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "Children know the difference between play and cruelty. They tied her to a tree. They left her to believe she was alone. That isn't ignorance. That is choice." Valor growled softly. Eli flinched, tears spilling. Clara pressed close to Margaret, whispering, "They left me." Her fragile truth silenced the square. The boys broke into sobs. "This was not a prank," Daniel said. "Do not call it a game. A prank is harmless. This was cruelty, and it could have cost a child her life. Their parents bowed their heads, tears falling. Daniel let the silence stretch, then, quieter but firm. "You can love your sons." "You should, but do not shield them. If they are to grow into men who protect instead of harm, they must feel the full burden of this night." His eyes swept the crowd. "We all carry responsibility. Innocence cannot guard itself. If we fail to teach compassion, we are complicit in cruelty." Later, Clara sat wrapped in a quilt outside the cottage, Mr. Buttons in her lap. Valor lay at her feet, watchful. Eli and Mason approached, pale and trembling. Daniel at their side. They tried to speak. "Clara, we didn't mean—" Eli's words faltered. Mason choked. "We thought it was a game, but we knew. And I'm sorry." Clara did not look at them. Her gaze stayed distant, her silence heavier than any accusation. Valor rumbled low, a steady warning. Daniel did not quiet him. The shepherd was speaking the truth. Clara could not. "You hurt her. I will not let you again." "She doesn't hate you," Daniel said. "She's afraid of you. And that's a weight you'll carry." The boys wept, broken, but forgiveness did not come. By afternoon, the square filled again. The village argued. Punishment or mercy, cruelty or childish foolishness. The voices clashed until Margaret emerged, her back straight, her grief hardened into steel. "You speak of punishment and mercy," she said, her voice carrying. "But you forget the heart of it. A child is broken. My Clara will never walk past those woods without hearing her own cries echo back. That is the weight she carries now." She turned to the boys. "And you will carry what you did, whether punished or forgiven. You will wake each day knowing you left a little girl tied to a tree, begging for someone to come. That is a sentence heavier than any this village can hand down." Silence fell. No one argued. The boys wept again, their parents' embraces powerless against the truth. Daniel stepped beside Margaret, his eyes sweeping the crowd. He did not need to speak. The truth was plain. The village had failed, not only in the boys' cruelty, but in its own complacency. Kindness had to be taught, nurtured, protected, as carefully as fire tended in a storm. Maple Hollow would carry this scar, as Clara carried her silence, and Daniel Harris, with valor at his side, vowed it would never be ignored again. The days after Clara Mayfield's rescue blurred together, but the nights carried their own cruelty. Sleep did not come easily. Only 2 nights after her return, a scream tore through Margaret's cottage. Clara thrashed beneath the quilts, her small body slick with sweat, her voice raw. "Don't leave me! Please don't leave me here!" Margaret rushed to her side, whispering prayers, stroking her hair. But the terror clung. Clara sobbed of ropes she couldn't break, of a darkness that swallowed her cries, of laughter that cut sharper than the cold. But Clara was never alone. From the first night, Valor had stationed himself at her bedside, a massive shadow stretched across the rug. At her first whimper, his ears twitched. At her first scream, he pressed close. When her sobs shook too hard, he climbed onto the bed, curling against her. Clara buried her face in his fur, clutching him as if drowning. His steady heartbeat became her anchor. Slowly, her trembling eased. Margaret sat at the edge of the bed, tears slipping silently. She saw what no lullaby could do. Valor carried the weight of her nightmares as if they were his own. One night, Clara woke mid-sob and whispered, "He keeps them away." Margaret could only nod, her heart breaking at the truth. Daniel Harris visited often, listening from the doorway. His jaw tightened at Margaret's stories, but his eyes softened when he looked at Clara curled against the shepherd. "Innocence doesn't heal overnight," he murmured once. "But she's not alone." That makes all the difference. Morning light softened Maple Hollow, but inside Margaret's garden lived a child who had learned too soon that safety could shatter. Clara walked slowly along the path, a quilt draped over her shoulders, Mr. Buttons dangling from her hand. Each rustle of leaves made her stiffen. Each creak of the gate widened her eyes. She was never alone. Valor padded beside her, silent as breath. At each sound, he leaned into her until her hand found his fur. Her fingers gripped tight, her breathing steadied. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, her chest aching with gratitude and sorrow. Safety was no longer hedges or fences. It was a shepherd shadowing every step. Clara crouched at the herb bed, setting Mr. Buttons in her lap. She pressed her forehead to Valor's neck, whispering secrets too soft for her grandmother to hear. She told him of the laughter that haunted her dreams, the silence that felt like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She asked the questions she couldn't ask aloud. Why did they do it? Why did they leave me? Valor didn't answer. He only curved his body around hers, still and solid. His ear twitched as though listening. Clara spoke until her voice shook, then held him wordlessly. Margaret, watching from the window, pressed her hand to her lips. Gratitude burned through her sorrow, for the dog who gave Clara what she could not. Wordless understanding. Later, Clara chased a butterfly. Her legs carried her a few steps before a tree's shadow fell across her path. She froze, trembling, the pine in her mind rising dark and merciless. Valor moved instantly, pressing his nose to her hand, then circling to place himself between her and the shadow. Clara quivered, then managed a single step, another. Finally, she bent to pick a wildflower, tucking it into Mr. Button's paw. Margaret stood in the doorway whispering, "Bless you, boy." Bless you for holding her. Evenings found Clara on the porch steps, whispering again, this time lighter words. Dreams of sunflowers taller than herself, of painting skies with her fingers, of forgiving the boys one day, but not yet. Valor listened, amber eyes steady in the fading light. Healing was a long road, but Clara did not walk it alone. The forest was quieter by day, but its silence carried weight. Daniel Harris walked alone, boots pressing into damp earth. The woods had always been his refuge after losing his wife and daughter. Now, each step toward the old pine felt like walking into unfinished business. The tree loomed tall, its bark scarred by rope. Daniel pressed his palm against the grooves. His chest tightened. Behind his eyes came a memory. Emily, his daughter, 9 years old, hair like sunlight, laughter light as air. He remembered her arms around his waist, her voice asking about deer and foxes. She had been gone for years, illness stealing her too soon, yet the grief lived sharp as ever. Standing before the pine, saving Clara had reopened that wound. But in the reopening, there was also light. He saw Clara clutching Valor, whispering, "I thought no one would find me." He saw Margaret collapsing in tears. He saw Valor guarding her like stone until her trembling eased. And he felt Emily near. "Maybe this is for you," he whispered. His voice cracked. "Maybe I couldn't save you, but I won't fail another." He dropped his hand, shoulders heavy but spine straight. Saving Clara hadn't erased his loss. Nothing could. but it had given his sorrow direction, a purpose. He looked down at the soil beneath the pine, where Clara's tears had fallen, where her cries had broken against silence. He clenched his jaw, the vow rising like fire. "Never again," he whispered. His voice steadied. "Never again will a child's cries go unheard in these woods. Not while I draw breath." The wind stirred through the branches, carrying his words deeper, as though the forest bore witness. Daniel stood long, letting resolve settle. At last, he turned back toward the village. His steps were slower, but his purpose was sure. The woods would no longer be just his refuge. They would be his watchtower. And beside him, in his mind's eye, walked a shepherd whose vigilance matched his own. Never again would innocence be left unguarded. The bell of Maple Hollow's church rang low that evening, its echoes rolling through the valley, like a call to reckon with more than faith. Families left their lamplit homes and converged on the old meeting hall, a place usually for harvest suppers and winter dances. Tonight, laughter was absent. Grief and guilt filled its walls instead. Rows of benches creaked as neighbors settled close together. Mothers clutched children on their laps, pressing kisses into their hair as if to anchor them. Fathers sat stiff-backed, their arms folded, brows furrowed. Lanterns glowed overhead, casting flickering shadows across faces marked by worry. At the front sat Margaret Mayfield, her granddaughter nestled in her lap. Clara's quilt was wrapped snug around her, curls spilling across her grandmother's shoulder. Mr. Buttons rested in her arms, worn but whole again. At her feet lay Valor, his massive frame curved protectively, amber eyes scanning the room with quiet vigilance. Clara's small hand clutched his collar, refusing to let go. Daniel Harris leaned against a beam nearby. He did not sit. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable, but his eyes missed nothing. Years of watching the forest for danger had trained him to recognize subtler threats here, excuses, denial, the urge to forget. When the murmurs stilled, the pastor spoke. His voice was gentle but heavy. "We gather tonight not for celebration, but for truth. A child was harmed in our woods. Not by strangers, not by beasts, but by two of our own." All eyes shifted away from Eli Harper and Mason Reed, seated pale and bowed with their parents on the far bench. Their mothers clutched them tightly, as if touch alone could keep them from drowning in judgment. A mother rose, her voice trembling. "We tell our children to be kind, but do we show them enough? Too often we laugh at cruelty, call it play. We cannot do that anymore." A father stood, stern. "Trust has been broken. If our children don't learn empathy under our roofs, then we've failed them before they step outside." An older woman lifted her cane and pointed toward Clara. "Look at her. She'll carry this night forever. If that doesn't teach us the cost of neglect, nothing will." The boys' fathers shifted in shame. Mr. Harper cleared his throat. "They are our sons. They have done wrong. We can't undo it. But we must teach them, not shield them." The room murmured in agreement, heavy but earnest. Clara stirred in Margaret's lap. Until then, she had kept her gaze low, her curls hiding her face. Now her lips trembled. Her voice, small and fragile, slipped into the silence. "I was so scared." The words rippled outward like stones dropped into still water. Every lantern seemed to flicker slower. Every breath caught. Clara's fingers clutched Valor's collar tighter. "But Valor found me." Her whisper cracked, but carried farther than any sermon. Every parent, every neighbor, every child old enough to understand, heard it. The hall fell into sacred silence. Margaret's arms tightened around her granddaughter, tears spilling freely. Valor pressed his muzzle against Clara's knee, answering without words. "He didn't leave me," she whispered. "Not even when it was dark." Her small voice broke, and she buried her face in his fur. Valor gave a soft whine, steady and low. Around the hall, villagers wept. Mothers hid their faces in handkerchiefs. Fathers bowed their heads, shoulders shaking. Even those who had begged for mercy for the boys were silenced by the truth of a child's voice. On the far bench, Eli and Mason sobbed openly. No lecture could cut deeper. Their parents' hands stayed firm on their shoulders, not in defense, but in sorrow, anchoring them to the weight of what they had done. "I thought no one was coming," Clara said softly. Her wide eyes swept the hall just briefly before falling back to Valor. "But he came. He saved me." The room broke. Tears spilled freely. The sound of weeping filled the hall. Grief and gratitude tangled into one. Daniel bowed his head. He had spoken of responsibility and cruelty, but nothing was clearer than this. Salvation, spoken in the trembling honesty of a 6-year-old, belonged to a dog who refused to leave her. The hush lingered. It was Margaret who finally spoke, her voice low but steady despite her tears. "This cannot be a story we tell once and forget. If we forget, we fail her again. We fail every child who trusts us." Her words cracked something open. A farmer rose. "We teach our children to work, to read, to be strong. But maybe we've forgotten to teach them the most important thing, to feel what another feels." A teacher nodded. "Empathy doesn't grow on its own. It has to be planted, tended. We can't hope our children learn it by chance. We must show them." Voices followed, weaving into agreement. "We'll gather them in the schoolhouse. We'll teach compassion, not just history. We'll make clear that cruelty, even small, leaves scars. We'll hold one another accountable." They were not grand speeches, but earnest words from neighbors who had seen a fragile child carried from the woods and knew they could not remain unchanged. At the front, Clara clung tighter to Mr. Buttons, Valor stretched protectively at her feet. His eyes half closed, but his ears twitched at every sound, storing each pledge like judgment. Daniel watched from the back, his arms still folded. He had seen promises before, too often broken. Change, he knew, was not born in a single night, but in daily, deliberate work. Still, as he looked at Clara's hand tangled in Valor's fur, a fragile thread of hope stirred. The pastor's voice carried through the hall. "Let us mark this night, not as the night innocence was broken, but as the night we chose to guard it more fiercely. We cannot erase what was done, but we can choose what comes next." The villagers murmured assent. Margaret pressed a kiss to Clara's curls. Valor pressed his muzzle against her quilt, steady as stone. Daniel exhaled slowly, scanning the faces. Parents holding children tighter, boys bowed in shame. Neighbors united not by anger, but by resolve. Seeds, he thought. These are seeds, and seeds can grow if tended. Valor gave a soft sigh, settling against the floorboards, resting but never fully at rest, always listening, always guarding. And as lantern flames dimmed, Daniel Harris knew one truth with certainty. Maple Hollow had been given a chance, and chances, no matter how fragile, were worth everything. The weeks after Clara Mayfield's rescue stretched long and uneven, like a road paved with both shadow and light. Maple Hollow went about its rhythms: markets, church, chores. Yet beneath everything pulsed the memory of that night. For Clara, the nightmares slowly loosened their grip, though they never disappeared. By day, she played in Margaret's garden, always within reach of Valor. By night, when shadows returned in dreams, she reached for him, finding his warmth steady as a heartbeat. Each time, he anchored her back to safety. Still, one wound lingered: the tree itself. The ancient pine loomed in her memory, like a monster waiting at the edge of the forest. It was Daniel Harris who finally suggested the return. One morning he told Margaret quietly, "She can't live her whole life fearing that tree. If she faces it with us beside her, it won't be only a place of pain. It can become something else." Margaret hesitated, worry clouding her eyes. But when she asked Clara if she wanted to go, the child nodded. Her lips trembled, but her head dipped in resolve. The day was bright when they set out, sunlight cutting golden beams through the canopy. Daniel led the way, his stride even. Margaret followed, her hand steady on Clara's shoulder. Valor padded beside them, his amber eyes sharp, his gait purposeful, as if he too understood. The air smelled of pine and damp moss. Clara's boots scuffed the trail, her small hand gripping Valor's fur, her other clutching a tiny bouquet of wildflowers. When the clearing opened, she froze. The pine towered above them, its bark scarred with faint rope marks. To anyone else, they might have blended with age. To Clara, they screamed. Her breath caught, her knees wobbled. Memory surged. The bark against her wrists, laughter fading into silence, the cold seeping into her bones. Margaret bent quickly. "You don't have to, darling. Not if you're not ready." Clara swallowed, voice shaking. "I want to." Valor pressed against her leg, anchoring her. His weight steadied her trembling frame. She looked down at him, buried her hand in his fur, and took a step, then another. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched. He stood just behind, hand brushing the knife at his belt. Not for protection now, but in memory of the night he had cut her free. Clara reached the pine. Slowly she lifted her hand and pressed it to the bark. The rough surface scraped her palm. For an instant she flinched, but Valor leaned harder into her, and she held steady. Her voice came soft but firm enough for the breeze to carry. "I'm not afraid anymore." Margaret covered her mouth, tears spilling. Clara knelt and placed the wildflowers at the tree's roots, arranging them carefully against the moss. Bright colors against dark soil, fragile but fierce. "They're for me," she whispered, "and for anyone who was ever scared here." The clearing still. Even the air seemed to listen. Daniel stepped forward, laying a calloused hand on her small shoulder. His voice was low, unsteady. "You're braver than most men I've known." Clara turned to him, eyes wet but steady. Then she bent and wrapped her arms around Valor's neck. "Valor made me brave," she whispered into his fur. The shepherd's tail gave one slow, steady thump. Margaret came forward, folding the child and dog into her arms, her tears flowing freely. Daniel stood back, his grey eyes softening. The scar on the pine would remain, but now it bore another meaning, not just cruelty, but survival. They turned to leave. Clara's steps were steadier now, her hand tight on Valor's collar. At the tree's base, the flowers swayed gently, a small, stubborn promise that fear could be transformed. Halfway down the path, sunlight poured through a gap in the canopy, touching Clara's curls with gold. She stopped there, leaning into Valor. Daniel paused too. Something in him stirred, an ache mixed with pride. He crouched until his eyes were level with hers. "What you did," he said softly, "touching that tree, leaving your flowers, that was braver than most grown men I've met." Her lips parted in surprise. Then her gaze dropped to Valor, who sat tall beside her, eyes fixed on her as if echoing Daniel's words. Clara sank to her knees and hugged him fiercely. "You're my hero," she whispered. "You found me. You saved me. I'll never forget." Valor leaned into her embrace, resting his head gently on her shoulder. His whine was soft, not sorrowful, but as if acknowledging her vow. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her chest. For weeks, she had watched her granddaughter walk with shadows. Now she saw light, fragile but real, return to the child's eyes. Daniel swallowed hard. Saving Clara had reopened the wound of losing his daughter Emily. Yet watching her cling to Valor, whispering thanks into his fur, he felt something shift. Not erasure of grief, but direction for it. "Heroes don't always wear uniforms," he murmured. His gaze rested on the shepherd. "Sometimes they just stay when no one else will." Clara nodded, her voice trembling but firm. "He stayed. He didn't leave me." Margaret's tears fell freely. She whispered a prayer of thanks, not only for survival, but for the fierce bond stitched between her granddaughter and the shepherd who had refused to let darkness win. Daniel rose slowly, joints stiff but spirit lighter. He laid his hand gently on Clara's shoulder. "You'll never be alone again," he said, "not with him by your side." Clara smiled faintly, patting Valor's fur as if sealing the promise. The sun slid low as they reached the meadow's edge. The quilt trailed behind Clara, brushing grass tops. Margaret hummed softly, the same lullaby she had once sung over Clara's cradle. Her granddaughter's steps were small, but no longer trembling. Daniel followed at a distance, scanning the trees out of habit. But the forest tonight was quiet, offering not menace, but peace. At the tree line he paused, watching grandmother and child walk toward the lantern glow of the village, Valor steady at Clara's side. The shepherd glanced back once, then nudged Clara forward, his stride sure, his presence unyielding. Daniel lingered, breathing in the scent of pine and moss. He thought of Clara's small hand pressed to the bark, her whisper, "I'm not afraid anymore." He thought of the bouquet at the roots, fragile yet defiant. The breeze moved through the trees, carrying memory but also something new. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the forest not as a burden, but as a companion, one that had witnessed sorrow, and now, healing. His throat tightened. He closed his eyes and listened. In the hush, he almost heard Emily's laughter, mingling with Clara's faint voice. Not cries of fear, but a melody of survival. When he opened his eyes, dusk had deepened to indigo. Ahead, Clara and Margaret walked toward the village lights, Valor close beside them, steadfast as always. Daniel let out a slow breath. "Never again," he whispered into the night, not as vow this time, but as truth he believed could hold. Then he turned and followed, his steps measured, his presence steady. The forest did not resist his leaving. It only whispered after him, carrying the voices of love and resilience in its branches. And as the night fell fully over Maple Hollow, the story of fear was closing, not erased, but transformed. What lingered now was not silence heavy with dread, but whispers soft with hope, borne on the wind through the pines. When we look back on Clara's story, what shines through is not just the sorrow she endured, but the steadfast love of a dog who refused to leave her side. German shepherds have always carried that gift, loyalty so deep it feels almost sacred. They remind us that healing often comes on four legs, with quiet eyes and a steady heart that asks for nothing in return. If you've ever felt that bond, you know it's unlike anything else. And if you're hoping to deepen it with your own dog, there are gentle resources out there that can guide you. Places where simple tips and heartfelt stories meet, offering ways to nurture trust and understanding. I sometimes point folks to one I've found meaningful, and I'd be glad to share it if you're interested. At the end of the day, what matters most is the time we give, the patience we show, and the love we return to these loyal companions. They give us their everything. The least we can do is hold them close, listen, and never take their quiet devotion for granted. Take this as a friend's reminder. Cherish the pause beside you.